Good afternoon and welcome to the 8th lecture of the 2025 fall season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series and the 30th lecture in total. Thank you all for coming. My name is John Carlton. I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Coalition, the Heritage Week Coalition, and the co-organizer of this lecture series. As always, I want to give a big thanks to Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us and to my co-organizer, Diane Dahoney, for everything she and her staff do for these lectures in the community. And of course, thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taking these lectures and for hosting them on their YouTube channel. And thanks to the State Journal for always giving us some great additional publicity. As we approach America 250, we find ourselves with an opportunity for reflection. The ability to look back at the promises made in our founding documents, the realities that contradicted them, and the long, unfinished struggle to reconcile those realities with our founding ideals. When the framers wrote that all men are created equal, they borrowed the noble language from the Enlightenment, and the era that gave us Isaac Newton's laws of motion and calculus, which described the motion of the planets around the sun, and later Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which revealed that all life is evolved from simpler life. Yet the same declaration that proclaimed universal equality and independence from an authoritarian monarch also called indigenous peoples savages. And the Constitution that proclaimed we the people counted a group of those people as 3/5 of a person. Those words, expansive in theory, were narrow in practice. Women, enslaved people, and indigenous peoples were excluded from the rights of citizenship and the protection of liberty. And while modern social media tropes and cable news talking points may claim that only 2% of whites owned slaves, such simplifications distort the truth. Slavery was not the misdeed of a few, it was the economic and social foundation of the entire American experiment, entrenched for nearly 2 centuries before our founding and independence. On the Kentucky frontier, like elsewhere in early America, enslaved peoples cleared land, built homes and villages, planted and harvested crops, tended livestock, raised children who were not their own, and kept households running. In towns and cities, they built courthouses, streets, and entire communities, laboring not only for their enslavers, but the prosperity of a society that benefited from their exploitation. This contradiction between Enlightenment ideals and human bondage defined the early republic, a contradiction that Justice John Marshall Harlan, a Kentuckian and Frankfort jurist himself, would confront centuries later in his great dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson, declaring that our Constitution is colorblind. Harlan saw perhaps more clearly than most that the arc of our American experiment must bend toward inclusion, or it would betray its own promise. Over the next year, as America commemorates its 250th anniversary, we are challenged to face the full truth of our origins, the brilliance of the ideas and the brutality of their implementation, not to wallow in guilt, but to take responsibility for truth, because honesty gives meaning to progress. And the progress that followed through abolition, suffrage, civil rights, and the ongoing struggles for equality for all people came from confronting our history, not sanitizing it. Yet we live in a time when that honest reckoning is again under threat, when book bans, history revisionism, and selective memory attempt to recast our nation's history in simpler, safer terms. But the laws of the universe do not care about our feelings, and history is not meant to comfort. It is meant to teach. If we erase the uncomfortable parts, we forfeit the very lessons that guide our moral evolution. So our goal for understanding the institution of slavery is to see it not as a footnote, but as a central chapter in the American story, to understand that truth is the foundation of justice, and that to move forward as a nation, we must first have the courage to remember, to question, to strive for continued improvement, and to see clearly who we have been, who we are, and who we still must become. And so without further ado, please welcome Adult Services Manager Diane Dahoney to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon. As John said, my name is Diane Dahoney. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the Paul Sawyer Public Library. On behalf of everyone here at the library, I just want to welcome you all out. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the Heritage Series. This afternoon, it is my great honor to introduce to you Dr. Vanessa M. Holden. She is an Associate Professor of History and serves as Director of African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. She is also the director of the Central Kentucky Slavery Initiative. Dr. Holden's book, Surviving Southampton, African American Women and Resistance in Nat Turner's Community, is the winner of the 2021 James Broussard Best First Book Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Her writing has been published in Slavery and Abolition, a journal of slave and post-slave studies, Perspectives on History, Process, a blog for American history, and The Rumpus. Dr. Holden serves as a faculty advisor on several public history and digital humanities projects, including Freedom on the Move and the Digital Access Project. Her current research focuses on slavery and enslaved people in Kentucky. Please help me to welcome to the podium Dr. Vanessa and Holden.
That's the thing about technology, right? We think it's going to make our lives easier, and then we get in front of it, and it never works like it's supposed to. Well, good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here. I drove out here from Lexington, through some pretty beautiful country, horses prancing around, fall leaves. I was like, ooh, you come over that hill into Frankfort, and I was like, okay, Kentucky's Kentucky today. So as you can probably tell from the way that I sound, I'm not originally from Kentucky. I'm originally from out west in California, but I did my undergraduate work in Virginia, and I'm now a Virginia specialist, technically. But since moving to Kentucky about 7 years ago, I dove into the really rich archive available here. Of course, Kentucky was once part of Virginia, so there's a lot that feels pretty familiar, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. And really, I walked downtown into the county clerk's office in Fayette County and saw row after row after row of deed books and will books and all sorts of other historic records. And I thought, oh, Lexington didn't burn to the ground in 1865. They've still got all this stuff. Stuff that in Virginia can be kind of hit or miss, depending on what county you're looking at. And I said, well, how available is this online? And a lot of it is available online, but it's behind a paywall. You gotta pay for a membership, or you gotta come here to Frankfort and go to the State Archive and scroll through microfilm and hope you don't get seasick before you find who you're looking for. So much of my work at UK through the Central Kentucky Slavery Initiative has really focused on access. And making the historic documents, first of Fayette, because that's where I live, but hopefully other surrounding counties and other places in the Commonwealth, their documents more accessible. Putting things online doesn't make them immediately accessible or perfectly accessible, but it's one step in a whole phase of steps that I'm working on with the Central Kentucky Slavery Initiative to make things more accessible. Through a partnership with the Fayette County Clerk's Office, I co-direct a project called the Digital Access Project. We have digitized nearly 200,000 pages of historical documents, and we've made them freely available on the county clerk's website. And we're working on a companion site that'll be a little easier to navigate. Right now, if you're not a lawyer or a real estate agent or a professional historian, it can be a little tough to get at what you're looking for. So we're working on making these not just accessible as in you can sit in your PJs and click on a PDF file accessible, but accessible in that we'll have interactive lessons to talk through what different documents can teach you. Another project that I'm working on, I'll talk about towards the end of the talk today, has to do with self-emancipated people. Most of you probably learned about these folks and call them runaways. And Kentucky's historical newspapers that offer us really a treasure trove of information about people who voted with their feet and took off in protest against enslavement. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. All that's to say, I'm really engaged with thinking about the complex story of slavery in a place like Kentucky. I've heard all sorts of things. You never want to be the slavery scholar at a party, because when people hear you're a historian and then they say, oh, what do you say? They really hope it's like World War II or, I don't know, Dolly Madison or something, And then you have to say, I study slavery, right? And then a cocktail party, immediate downer, right? But when when people ask, I've gotten a number of responses. Either, oh, I didn't really get to learn about that. I knew it existed, but I didn't really get to learn about that in school. Or, wasn't slavery not really that important here? There really weren't that many enslaved people here, right? Yeah, I see some confused looks. That's the right reaction, right? And I thought, where are people getting this idea from? That slavery just wasn't that important here. So I dove into these documents, kind of asking a lot of questions about, well, how do I demonstrate to folks that A, slavery, the system, was important here, but really A+, that enslaved people made enormous contributions to this Commonwealth, and the kind of evidence of their contributions is everywhere. And while slavery, even our founding fathers grappled with and could say, that's not something to celebrate, the accomplishments of enslaved people and their many allies along the way are things that we should look back on and celebrate. So a little bit about what I'm going to cover today. Okay, technology, work with me. We're going to talk about the origins of slavery in Kentucky, what slavery in the U.S. actually was as a system, and we're going to talk through really the hardest part of any talk I've got to get through, especially when I'm talking to students, which is, trying to explain something that doesn't make any sense, right? Trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. How do you take a person and make them a piece of property, right? I'm going to do my best to show you how all of our ancestors worked through that one, but I want to foreground by saying, yeah, no, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's going to continue to not make a lot of sense the more I talk. We're going to talk about the business of slavery, the system itself, because the business of slavery really was the bedrock of the Commonwealth's economy. And then we're going to talk about some human stories and human costs by looking at some new directions that my own research is taking. I'm not going to get to everything. I'm not going to get to every possible story or way to cover this history, but hopefully what I talk about today will open up some questions that you have, or get you thinking in a different way than you've thought before. And I'm happy to field questions and answer them to the best of my ability when I wind down. There are some short, simple answers to these questions. And so rather than making you wait to the very end, like a sort of reveal, I'm just going to give you those short answers. And then we'll go into more depth as I move on in the lecture today. So what was slavery? There used to be an old question in history where historians would go back and forth and ask, well, what came first, slavery or race, as a way of categorizing people. And the easy answer there is, well, obviously slavery. Slavery has existed for almost all of human history in various forms. There have been many, many ways that humans have found to make other humans do labor for them. It's existed in ancient societies, it exists in modern societies. There are places in the world where it exists today. So really the question is about the specific form that slavery took in what became the US. There's a type of slavery called Atlantic slavery, so slavery that happens really roughly starting in the 1400s, and has to do with European interactions along the west coast of Africa. But even the ways that different European nations come to practice slavery vary. It varies because of region, because of crop, sometimes because of religious affiliation. And so we got to zero in on what was slavery here. First in those 13 colonies that become the United States, and then out here in what was the West at the time, in Kentucky, the first state west of the mountains. So when we talk about slavery in the US, we're really talking about race-based chattel slavery. So let me break down each part of this term. So race-based. That means that race determined if someone could be enslaved.
In ancient societies, for example, the way that somebody became enslaved was often because they were conquered in war. So the Roman army shows up, they defeat you in battle, they take the people who are living back with them, disperse them around the empire, they're slaves now because they've been conquered. Sometimes slavery had to do with debt. You get indebted to somebody, you can't pay off your debts, you get bound out, and your labor is now owned by somebody. So one of the big things that makes a huge difference in Atlantic slavery and in US slavery is that it's based on this kind of new category in human history, race. Race also determined a free person's access to civil rights. So race comes to not just determine who could be slaves, but also how people who were of different racial categories had access to kind of civil society, even outside of slavery. Chattel. So a chattel is a movable piece of property. So unlike in, say, Imperial Russia, where serfs who lived and had kind of living conditions actually pretty close to enslaved people, they were tied to specific land. So their labor could be sold off with the land, but they weren't movable in the same way. Chattel sounds a lot like cattle. They have some similar root words. And movable property meant you could be sold like livestock. So enslavers had complete control over enslaved people's lives. I mean, that slave systems all over the globe and across different time periods, the level of control an enslaver had over someone's life was really different society to society. There are some where they have complete control, some where they don't. But the system that develops here, they have complete control over somebody's life. Enslavers owned people's labor, and they owned the product of their labor. And so it's also important to remember. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, why it's important that they didn't just own their work, they also owned the product of their work. So today, I'm going to talk, we say, this is a lecture about slavery, but really it's a lecture about slavery and enslaved people. So I'm going to talk about the system of slavery. It's an economic system. It can be a social system. But I'm also going to talk about enslaved people and their lives and their experiences. So of course, enslaved people are individuals whose labor, innovation, and actions contributed to the success of Kentucky commerce. They're families and communities who helped to define Kentucky's rich cultural heritage. And freedom fighters who, alongside white allies, challenged Kentucky and the US to live up to its revolutionary promise. Talking about the system of slavery, it's a labor system. It's an economic system. It's a business. It's actually businesses. We'll get into that. And it also influences social hierarchy. So I'm going to give you an example from the primary sources, from the documents. And I understand from where you're sitting, you're not going to be able to see this 100% perfectly. Don't worry, I'm going to zoom in some key places. So this is a broadside. It's announcing an auction in January of 1855. The agent who's in charge of this, who's in charge of the sale is listed down here, of Lewis County, Kentucky, which is just up the river from Maysville, north of here. And has used the typography of the poster to make sure that passersby get the big, important information. There's going to be a sale of slaves. And then here are the wares up for sale. Some things you'll quickly notice about how individuals are listed. If we zoom in, there we go. You'll notice language that doesn't actually recognize the humanity of each individual, using terms that are pejorative or terms that are used for animals. You'll note that ages are very important because it denotes someone's capacity for labor. And then when pertinent, like in the case of Sally, who was 42, who at the time would have been considered older, on the older side for an enslaved laborer, special skills to make these individuals more important, sort of more valuable on the open market are listed. So all of these descriptors here are about monetary value, right? Getting the most out of this auction, making sure that passersby know that there's quality human property for sale here. Folks with important skills, an excellent cook. In the 1850s, she likely was cooking over an open hearth using cast iron cookware. It took incredible skill. It actually took years to learn how to do that the right way. And a good cook was hard to find. Even this older man in his 50s, again, we're talking about the 1850s here, so these ages would have been considered, they would have been considered closer to elders in their community. A good kennel man, when mentioned he was good with dogs. All of the things here, right, are about the business side of slavery. Because this particular enslaver, John Carter, who is going to put these enslaved people up for sale at Sheepside Market in downtown Lexington, is actually headed to Indiana, a free state. And really what he's doing is he's selling off all of these enslaved people to finance his move. They're worth hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And they really are the property that's going to make his move possible. He also notes that all of these people were all raised on his plantation at Quick's Run in Lewis County. They've never been anywhere else. They've all been in the same place. Give you a better look at that language there. So in one sense, we can look at this document, right? And we can see the ways that enslavers are marketing enslaved people based on their special skills, based on their ages, based on their ability. We can see a record, right, of monetary value. How do you value a human in dollars and cents? Read another way, that everybody listed here is all from the same place, allows us to ask some different questions. Seeing past dehumanizing language to ask, how many families are represented here? Are Sally and this individual who's 52, are they brother and sister? Are they married? Liza's listed here with a 6-month-old child, who, by the way, she could be purchased with, but enslavers actually didn't have to purchase them together. Right. Does she have other children listed here amongst these boys and young men from 12 to 20? So in one document, you get a sense of like, what are the different layers? The history of slavery, the system, the business, and the history of enslaved people, right? Their whole family, community, probably about to be split up and sent to different places further south, excuse me, right? All in one section. So this document's from the 1850s, on the eve of the American Civil War, at a time when slavery is a hot-button political issue, really political football being thrown back and forth to try and determine how settlement out west is really going to go. How do we get here to one of the largest slave markets in the Upper South in Kentucky? How do we get to a place where humans are referred to like property and sold as if they were livestock on the open market? Like I said before, the kind of slavery that comes to exist in Kentucky has its origins in the Atlantic. The Atlantic world, what historians call the Atlantic world, really any landmass that touches the Atlantic Ocean. Different European nations practice slavery differently, but it's important to note that this thing, race, develops everywhere that slavery is practiced. It's a social category, and it's not real. And it's one of the most frustrating things to cover with students because we know that race isn't real. We know that there's no biological basis for some sort of difference between people. We know that we have features that differ from each other sometimes, but those features don't mean anything about our ability or our intelligence. But over time in the Atlantic world, race, sometimes based on skin color, sometimes based on other factors, comes to define all social hierarchy. And over time, not immediately, but over time, eligibility for enslavement comes to be determined by race. In England's North American colonies, slavery wasn't an immediately popular labor source for landowners. They weren't immediately convinced that slavery was actually the best way, best way to go. And this kind of bears out in the patterns of shipping folks across the Atlantic Ocean. Most enslaved people that came to North America and to England's North American colonies actually disembarked in South America, the Caribbean, and Mexico first. So they're actually coming to what becomes the United States from other places. A much, much smaller number of enslaved people come directly from West Africa to Britain's North American colonies. And ultimately, most people disembark somewhere and then end up shipped further up the Atlantic coastline from somewhere else. So many of you have probably seen an illustration like this that shows this massive wave of people caught up in the Atlantic trade being shipped from all down the Western and Central African coast. And there's this tiny little arrow that comes up here to the United States to represent the slave trade directly to the US. More accurately, the slave trade probably should look something like this, with arrows pointing out of the Caribbean. So out of the French Caribbean to French Louisiana, out of the English Caribbean to the North American colonies, with ships making stops all the way up the coastline. So we have here, we have a line here from Barbados, an English-speaking colony. And the trade is triangular. It even somewhat goes back. There are very few tiny number of people who end up back in Europe and then continue to make this route around the Atlantic coasts. So, like I said, it's not initially a really popular way for landowners to find laborers. And this has to do with a few ins and outs of sort of early English settlement in North America. Initially, conflict with native nations is a really large factor for colonists. And most did not think importing a group of people who absolutely did not want to be there and did not want to work for them was a good idea if Native American attack was a serious concern. They wanted more population from Europe, people they could trust to stand with them against native attack. And overwhelmingly in places like Virginia, in Maryland, in Massachusetts, Landowners import people on labor contracts called indentures. They sign those contracts for a certain period of time, usually 7-ish years. They work off the debt of their passage from England or even the Netherlands or some other sort of Western European country. They work off the debt of their passage, and then they're free to go on their own way. Using indentured servants was way more popular among landowners even after tobacco arrives as a major cash crop from the Caribbean. And it's not until a little bit later in the 1600s that enslavers start to see the benefits to them for importing more and more enslaved people. Tobacco arrives really early in Virginia's history to the Chesapeake Bay region from the Caribbean. It's a cash crop. It's a 13-month crop. There's something to do for it every month of the year. You need a large labor force to grow it and make it profitable. The thing that happens in the late 1600s is all those indentured servants who managed to live long enough to serve their term, they also would like to have some land of their own. They kind of become a problem for the very rich, wealthy landowners. They're continually pushing west. They're inciting conflict with Native Americans on the frontier. And they have all the rights of free Englishmen, which is also an issue for very rich, wealthy landowners. And they think owning people for life and having access to their labor for life is going to be way more profitable for them in the long run. So over time, Virginians develop a legal system that made slave labor much more attractive than constantly purchasing labor contracts for European servants. And this is about to be kind of an overload of text, but I want to give you the full legal statute. What's most important about these next couple of slides is that you see really it is a slow kind of march over time to define what slavery is going to even be. And it's a slow march over time of the wealthiest landowning folks in Virginia and Maryland. So in 1662, Virginia declares that children will follow the condition of their mothers, upending centuries of European culture where children follow the condition of their dad. Their dad's the person who determines their status. In this case, if your mother is free, you're free. If your mother is enslaved, you are enslaved. And it establishes slavery in what becomes the U.S. as a hereditary condition. It's something you can inherit from a parent. Maryland outlaws interracial marriage in 1664. In 1667, they decide baptism is not going to guarantee freedom, so converting to Christianity does not automatically make somebody eligible for freedom. In 1669, this is kind of the smoking gun statute. Because in Virginia, they decide that enslavers can't be charged with the murder of the enslaved people that they own. And it's this statute that really shifts slavery from being just a system of labor to being a system of ownership. If you can't be charged with the murder of your own enslaved person, then you actually own them, not just their work. You own them. There's also some legislation around who can actually own enslaved people, and who can be owned. And here you can see that categorization of race hasn't really gelled up yet. That you should separate people by skin color doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And they use sort of religious terms, so Christians versus non-Christians. And it's not until the 1680s that they even pass statutes about, let me go back there, about slave rebellion. So limiting who can actually carry weapons, limiting the mobility of enslaved people. So you have to have written permission to leave the home of your enslaver. Punishing a slave who raises their hand against any Christian or European. And also making it lawful to kill anyone who resists arrest if they flee slavery. They passed statutes about gathering together. They passed statutes about interracial relationships. They passed statutes about people being declared slaves immediately upon arrival. And the point of showing you statute after statute here is to make clear that all these rules about slavery that become sort of just a part of the culture by the 1850s had to be carefully legislated. They had to be written out. They had to be made law. Now, I know everybody who got here today absolutely drove exactly the speed limit to get here, right? Because the speed limit said 55, you went 54, right? You obeyed that. No, we know how speed limits work, right? Our laws around speed limits are for a few different things, right? They help us understand, well, at what point is somebody reckless, right? The expectation isn't actually you're gonna go exactly 55, it's if you're going 75 in a 55 versus 60 in a 55, we have some sense of what's reckless there, right? You also don't need to have speed limits, right? If people just intuitively will go a reasonable speed. You don't need people to track down people who are going over the speed limit if people just intuitively on the honor system are gonna go the right speed, right? So when we think about what laws can tell us, they actually tell us a little bit more about what people were doing as opposed to what people were not doing. So for example, you don't need to make a law about interracial relationships if there are no interracial relationships happening, right? And you'll notice here that this law about interracial sex and interracial relationships isn't actually punishing enslaved people or people of African descent. In this case, the law says any white woman who has a mixed race child is punished with a fine or indenture, and the indenture of her child until they turn 30. So who is the law punishing and policing here? Women, white women. Why do you need a law about this if nobody's having interracial children? And why do you need to punish them? Because you need everybody to get in line. You need people to not see each other as the same. You need people to see each other as separate, as different. And you build in an actual advantage, right, to getting in line with the law. Yeah?
Are these codes, are they like one colony or zero?
So with the exception of the code I showed you on the previous page that bans interracial marriage in Maryland, these are all Virginia codes. The Virginia laws actually go on to influence the laws in Kentucky. In fact, the Virginia slave code is almost moved verbatim right into Kentucky. They differ a little bit colony to colony. So in the mid-Atlantic, in what becomes New York, some of the laws there are actually Dutch laws. Some of them are borrowed from other English colonies. That's a great question. Yeah, so I'm giving you Virginia laws because they impact Kentucky the most. So to give you a sense of how rapidly the enslaved population increases, and in this case in Virginia, I'll give you the numbers, but it's also helpful to see the percentage of the population. Because of course, these numbers, when you think of the whole state of Virginia, that doesn't look like a lot of people now, but at the time, right, we're talking about, you know, those statutes governing about 3,000 people. So about 7% of Virginia's population. By the eve of the American Revolution, enslaved people make up about 42% of the population. Some of that has to do with direct imports directly from the West African coast in the 18th century. Some of it has to do from what enslavers call natural increase, but we would call children. So we see huge investment by enslavers not in indentured labor contracts for Europeans anymore. They are heavily investing in enslaved property. And focusing in on these years in particular, we see that at exactly the time that the enslaved population in the East is skyrocketing, some important events are happening out west in Kentucky. And so you're all probably wondering at this point, okay, that's great, Atlantic, Virginia, laws, blah, 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 blah. What does this have to do with Kentucky? Well, at the end of the French and Indian War, the British famously create this little line on the map, and they say, okay, we're not going to let any of our colonists travel west of that line. And yes, of course, there were people already living there. The Shawnee are the big group. There are actually a few different groups out here in Kentucky at the time, but the Shawnee are the major group. That line is just on a map, though, and it doesn't actually really play well with our early Kentuckians. In reality, there were already people out there. There were already people who were looking at the Ohio River Valley and thinking about the best ways to settle it. And even before the American Revolution, there are intrepid folks who come out to places west of the mountains. They spend a lot of their time hunkering down in forts, but they're out here. And the British aren't really able to keep control over that westward movement. As the American Revolution dies down, if we zoom in on the map, we see, let me give you the map key. Boop. We see that there is already in the Ohio River Valley and in what becomes central Kentucky, significant settlement by the English. As the war winds down, and especially after the federal government promises Revolutionary War veterans land claims out west, we begin to see a massive movement of people west over the mountains. Many of the people who come to Kentucky are coming at least through Virginia. Some come from the Carolinas, some from Pennsylvania, but it really is an overwhelming movement of Virginians. So here they go. There go our Virginians. And they get out here, maybe Revolutionary War veterans, maybe some of those folks who managed to survive their indentures long enough, but were hopeful that this would be the place they could buy some land and have their own farm. Maybe there's some folks who owned 4 or 5 enslaved people, but not a massive plantation in Virginia, and thought this is our chance. But when they get out here, what they find is that a lot of the land is tied up, not in sort of the parcels that the federal government hopes to promise folks, but land speculators, people who already have big plantations over here, have bought up a bunch of land and they're hoping to turn a profit. Some of them are actually moving out here and hoping to kind of reproduce the same massive tobacco plantations. Hoping, not necessarily succeeding, but hoping to make that happen. So when these folks, these regular folks, get out here and are trying to settle, what they find is that big money back east is making it harder and harder for them to even approach that dream. While a lot of the myth of Kentucky is that it is these sort of intrepid pioneers or, poor to middling settlers who find the kind of revolutionary promise and dream out here. In reality, it's overwhelmingly initially really wealthy people, or people who had a little bit of something back east. So maybe they had a small family farm and a small group of enslaved people. Folks who come out here as a part of what's called planter migration, so they pick up their small slave holdings and move west, they're the ones who are successful, not the kind of folks who are really hoping that this is going to be that one chance they have at owning land. And we see a lot of early activity, even in those very early days, that give us some clues that slavery is going to make its way west too. And in fact, we see not just that enslaved people in those early days are valued for their laboring capacity, so land clearing, building, all the construction and labor that's needed to make even basic agricultural operation possible, sure. But we also see that enslaved people are valued for their specialized knowledge and skills. So this is a copy of the Kentucky Gazette, first newspaper west of the Allegheny. And it is founded in the early days here in Kentucky, the 1780s. And it has a number of really fascinating things in it. But in my work with our historical newspapers here in Kentucky, I came across an advertisement that's a really great demonstration of the ways that early Kentuckians are not just valuing enslaved people for their labor, but also for their specialized knowledge. So just to give you a sense of where this is on the page, that's where this ad is. But I'm going to blow it up here so you can see it a little bit bigger. So initially, this is an advertisement for something that pops up all over Kentucky's early newspapers, some new stills. In fact, there's a lot of stills for sale in early Kentucky newspapers. And of course, they're the highest of quality. They come with all the vessels and fittings that you need to make them work, and they're all in good order. But also available is a likely young Negro man, a good distiller. Also a very likely Negro girl, 16 years of age. And at that time, the word likely probably meant, it could mean both handsome and healthy. So it's not just that you could purchase some new stills, you could actually purchase the person who had the distilling knowledge needed to make those stills profitable for you. And he's also selling a horse, a lot of horse ads in early Kentucky newspapers too. But it's a really good example of the ways that people are not just thought about for their laboring capacity, but thought about for their specialized skills. So like I said, of course, Kentucky becomes the first state west of the mountains. And Kentucky now has a reputation for being a pretty homogeneous place, but Kentucky's history is actually pretty diverse and dynamic. There's a lot of kinds of people out here. Native Americans, land speculators, planter migrants, poor and middling settlers, free people of color, religious communities, enslaved people, business owners. Yes, a significant drive for people moving into the Commonwealth is available land and a desire to become part of agricultural production. But because of Ohio River traffic, especially in the early days of the Commonwealth, it also becomes a really important site of early American commerce. It's a pretty religiously diverse state. There are all sorts of people here. I know now we think of Baptists and Methodists as pretty mainstream, but at the time, many of them were fleeing communities back east that didn't accept them and didn't accept their beliefs. There's a significant Catholic population in Kentucky. Eventually, there'll be some pretty famous religious sects in Kentucky, like the Shakers, they're here. We have a number of sort of sects of the peace churches, Mennonites, Quakers, all in the mix, all here. And that level of diversity, religious tolerance, makes Kentucky this place in early America where people really are testing the promise of the Revolution. Can America really be a place where everybody's created equal, where everybody, regardless of their station at birth, has access to the American dream, their own property, their own success? In the early constitutional squabbles in Kentucky, there is a lot going on around these very principles. There is a significant vocal anti-slavery faction at those constitutional conventions in Kentucky who don't want slavery to spread west. They don't win, but they're there and they're vocal. One thing that Kentucky does to significantly lean into revolutionary principles is they allow for universal male suffrage. They let all men, regardless of property holding, not race, but regardless of property holding, they let them vote, which is not true back east. Back east, you have to own a certain amount of land, but out here, they're letting everybody participate. Like most of the American story, it's a both and. There are steps forward, there's hesitation to live out those promises. Here in Franklin County, two individuals, the Browns, so John Brown, not that John Brown, but a different John Brown, who actually plays a huge role in revolutionary politics in Virginia, is actually a really good example of one of these wealthy migrants from back east. He comes out west to make a name for himself. He does. He serves as a senator from Kentucky. His house, Liberty Hall, is still here, still standing in downtown Frankfort. You can go visit it. In his 40s, he actually marries the much younger Margaretta Mason, who becomes Margaretta Brown. And really, their papers give us a sense of the kind of complex legacy of both the Revolution and slaveholding in Kentucky, reading their personal letters, their diaries, their correspondence, and looking at their actions, we see two sort of conflicted people. They both maintain a household of enslaved people, as Margarita says, for their comfort, and participate in anti-slavery activities. She donates to the American Colonization Society, a society that wants to build a colony in West Africa for newly freed enslaved people. He also publishes through sort of Presbyterian religious publications, not anti-slavery, but at least sort of pro-gradual emancipation sentiment. In their personal lives, they're both enslavers who emancipate some of the people that they hold as slaves, but not others. And while they talk about in their papers teaching their children that slavery was wrong and it shouldn't expand, both of their sons go on to own massive land holdings, one in Alabama, one here in Kentucky, and go on to own hundreds of people. In many ways, they're a really good example of sort of that generation's hope, but real inability, right, to let go of the benefits of slavery. And we see in just the next generation and their sons, something that really follows national patterns, serious buy-in when it comes to slavery. It wouldn't be a history lecture if there weren't some good old-fashioned history, facts, and dates. So it's not by accident that slavery not only spreads to Kentucky, but also becomes the major business of the Commonwealth. Famously, the cotton gin is invented by Eli Whitney in 1794. There'd been other cotton gins before. The one he invents actually is good at processing the kind of cotton that grows in the southern US. So that's the big deal. The president buys Louisiana from the French, and of course at the time Louisiana encompassed the boot that we all know, but basically almost all the land west of the Mississippi to Washington State and California. And when that purchase goes through, they make a rule that says you cannot import enslaved people there directly from Africa. You can import them from other regions. In 1808, the US outlaws the Atlantic slave trade. And that means you can no longer import people directly from Africa. The War of 1812 takes place. And the war that sees heavy participation from Kentuckians really impacts the amount of influence Native nations have in what becomes the Deep South. And in the midst of that major historical moment, the first steamboat arrives in Louisville from Pittsburgh. With the invention of steam power and the end of the war solidifying US control of the Mississippi River, suddenly the technology for expanded commerce and a massive cash crop makes slave sales much bigger business than slave ownership. So while migration patterns have previously been east to west, we're going to start seeing both voluntary and forced migration patterns overwhelmingly from the upper South to what becomes the deep Cotton South. And so these arrows all represent slaving routes. There is a water-bound slaving route around the tip of Florida into New Orleans and into the Gulf Coast of Texas. But you'll notice the both overland slaving route that goes directly through Kentucky and the Ohio River traffic that leads to Mississippi River traffic that makes Kentucky a particularly good and rich slaving ground. This is an illustration of a coffle marching near Paris, Kentucky. In New Orleans, by the eve of the Civil War, a prime-aged field hand, male field hand, could go for well over $1,000, making it possible to sell an enslaved person in Lexington and make almost 50 to 65% profit or return on investment in New Orleans. Slave sales and the increasing price of slaves, because nobody was being imported from Africa, often made enslaved people in Kentucky more valuable than the land they worked. They themselves became the property that made people's estates valuable. And if they were women, the promise of their children, who were also property, exponentially could grow someone's holdings. It's not just Kentuckians, it's bankers in the Northeast, it's bankers in Richmond, Virginia, invent all sorts of financial products to bolster the slave economy. You could take out insurance policies on enslaved people. You could borrow against enslaved people to purchase land. You could hire out enslaved people and live off of their wages. A lot of widows did that. So it's true. In Kentucky, there's a very small number of people who own kind of sprawling, Gone with the Wind style plantations. They exist, but they're a relatively small number of people. Most enslavers owned between 4 and 10 people, if they could afford to own anyone at all, because they're very expensive. And so more money was made hiring people out, because it was cheaper to hire in labor than it was to purchase an enslaved person. Enslaved people were sometimes gifted to people's children. So today, some parents can afford to help their kid buy a car or buy their first house. In this period in Kentucky, you might give son number 2, who's not gonna get the family land, a handful of enslaved people to take with him to the California gold fields. Or maybe not that far, maybe just to Arkansas or just to Missouri, right? And he can borrow against them. He can sell them. He can wait to see if they have children and sell those children instead, right? To continually produce wealth. And in fact, crass as it is to put it this way, enslaved people became valued not just for their laboring capacity, but because they became exponentially valuable as financial products. If you follow the money of slavery, you end up in all sorts of interesting places. Follow the slaves, you end up exactly where you think you're going to end up, an auction block that leads to a long walk down to Alabama, or a boat ride down to New Orleans, and then another walk into the Louisiana countryside or into Mississippi. You end up in a cotton field, you end up in a tobacco field, you end up working on a wharf, you end up working the river boats. But if you follow the money, you end up in a blacksmith's pocket, because somebody's got to make all the iron goods you need to move people overland. You end up in a tavern keeper's till, because you got to stop all along the way. You end up in a judge's office, because fees need to be paid to make sure these legal transactions happen. You end up in a county clerk's notebook. You end up all the way in Boston at an insurance agency's records. You end up all sorts of places. It's easy to think that the money, following the money, leads you to cotton. And it's not that there wasn't lots of money in cotton. There was. But the real money is in the business of sale. This is an image of an auction in downtown Lexington at Cheapside Market. I don't know that I've ever seen another photograph of a slave auction. I've seen a lot of drawings of slave auctions in my time in the archives. I think this might be the only photograph I've ever seen. This is the auctioneer here with his arms up in the air. And there's a woman here on the auction block. If you go downtown in Lexington, there's a big courthouse there that was built in the 1880s. It's roughly on the site of where all this happened. So people really were banking on slavery. But what about enslaved people? Actually, some of the most famous enslaved people in American history come from Kentucky, because it was a huge conduit for the Underground Railroad and flight from slavery. So up here in the corner, that's William Wells Brown from Montgomery County. He's a novelist, he's a historian, he's a playwright, he's also a famous abolitionist. As you can see, this hairstyle was very popular at the time. This is actually Henry Bibb. I know they look really similar. He's from down in Oldham County, along the river. He and his wife are sold multiple times. He escapes multiple times and returns to find his wife in various locations before eventually ending up in Canada. And these are the Haydens, my neighbors in Lexington, who fled Lexington for Canada with the help, actually, of two white abolitionists. Delia Ann Webster, a white woman, famously actually serves time in the state penitentiary for helping them. The legacy of flight from Kentucky really exposes, again, that kind of diversity of folks who live in Kentucky that I talked about earlier. A lot of times it's easy to look back and say, well, that was a different time, and they all thought, everybody thought it was right. And Kentucky actually gives us really key examples of plenty of people saying, no, this is wrong, actually, and we plan on actually risking jail time, risking our livelihood to help people escape. The Ohio River really is a base of operations for flight north, and later on to Canada. And it's one of the reasons that I'm doing the project I am with students at the University of Kentucky called SEEK, Self-Emancipated and Enslaved in Kentucky. They are combing through our digital collection of Kentucky's historical newspapers to find and clip advertisements like these ones. And we're in the process of building out a searchable website that you can actually search for individuals and locations. And we plan to actually use mapping as a search tool, so you can zoom in on your own community and see, are there ads from near you If we just mapped the publication place, you're going to get a lot of Lexington and Louisville. You just get a lot of dots on top of Lexington. But if we zoom in on where people are advertising from, we actually get a really cool constellation of the whole Commonwealth. We also see editors printing advertisements from other states because they expect people to run through Kentucky to get to freedom. And the thing about this is every time I read one of these 19th century newspapers, I come across a story I'm not really expecting to find. And a way that doing this history really bears out that old adage that a high tide rises all boats. So for example, at the clerk's office, we're digitizing every document. We're not actually picking and choosing. Everybody's history gets digitized. Everybody's history gets better access because we're doing this project. And in collecting these advertisements, I've found some really interesting stories that bear out both what I've been talking about the business of slavery, but also the very human reality of living day to day with this system. This newspaper advertisement is in fact an advertisement for some self-emancipated people. But the story that emerges about the Nederlands, the enslavers in question, is a little bit more scandalous. If you look in the 18th century and early 19th century newspapers in Kentucky, you'll find advertisements not just for runaway enslaved people, but you'll also find ads for runaway wives. And the wives, you have to understand, formal divorce is almost impossible to access. And Kentucky is really trying to demonstrate that it's, a settled place. It's a new state, They got senators, they got a beautiful capital, all these things. It is still a little rough and tumble out here west of the mountains. And so sometimes wives would just up and run away. They would decide that Jim Bob's farm wasn't all he said it was going to be when they left Virginia, and so she wants to take up with Jeb instead. And so men would place these advertisements, and this is a practice that comes over from England. It happens in England, it happens here. And the reason they're advertising that their wife has run away isn't necessarily to get her back. It's actually to get creditors to stop giving her credit in his name. Women couldn't have their own bank accounts. They were civilly dead. And so if she goes and shops at a market, if she buys a cow, she's actually putting that on his account, right? So it's like I said, this gets very messy very quickly, okay? So then he's got to put his business out there and be like, look, she ran away, she took up with this other guy. And in the case of Mary Nederland, she actually took some enslaved people with her. Now, this could be for a couple reasons. It could be that she brought them into the marriage, and she always thought of herself as their owner, and they thought so too. So when she took off with this other dude, they were like, we're out. We're also out of here. We're going to go with you. It could be that this new man she took up with, as this advertisement alleges, that he tricked her into bringing these enslaved people along because they knew they could sell them and get good money for them. So he's trying to kind of swindle her out of some of her money. And we know this, if we zoom in, we know that the ad is maybe a little bit more about this property than it is about getting Mary back. Because his agent actually says, please be cautious of purchasing or hiring said Negroes from said Mary or Parsons. This is the guy she ran off with. And also, she's legally divested of all power of making use of any property belonging to said John Nederland, and further, any property in my possession belonging to him, right? So here we have a very messy personal situation. These two are estranged. She ran off with somebody else. And she took enslaved people with her because she probably plans on staking her own freedom, selling them, right? And this story, while maybe better suited for a Bravo reality television show than a history lesson, right, does bring forth some of the complexity of how enslavers are using enslaved people, right, to benefit in their own lives. She only has a couple of folks here. She doesn't own a big plantation. She's not a super wealthy, plantation mistress with the hoop skirt and the whole 9 yards, right? But she's very savvy about how she can use this system, right, to financially benefit herself. And caught up in it are people, individuals who are being traded like cows or chickens or goats. And one of the things I think is so important about exposing this history is it allows us to really see the human stories and human costs. That there's this high-level business story happening at the same time that deeply personal scenarios. I don't know if John Netherland was any good. He might have been no good. She might have needed to run from him. I don't know, right? These deeply personal stories that we really are talking about humans here, humans that often lived in pretty close proximity, and interface with this system in really interesting and complex ways. Well, I hope today, over the course of my talk, you learned some new things, not just the scandalous things at the very end. But I hope you've also come up with some good questions for me. Because I know I have plenty of questions. Every time I think I've found something new or I've answered a question for myself, I find new people, new scenarios, and new surprising and unbridled things, especially in these newspapers. So thank you very much for listening today, and I'm happy to field your questions.
Okay, I'm going to bring the mic around so they can hear your questions on TV.
Okay, I think I got a little confused at the beginning because you had slavery, and then the owner, once he finished his project, then he could just let the slave go free, and then if he did, where did he go to? Where did he go work, or did he become a slave again? I'm confused.
I'm trying to think which story you're talking about at the very beginning. Oh, okay. Yeah, so the system of indenture, it's a legal contract. So somebody in England, let's say, a poor farmer, they don't own their own land, they want to go to the New World, but they can't afford to get on the boat. They can't afford to pay for it. So they'll find a landowner in Virginia, and they'll sign over, say 7 years, and they say, I'll work for you for 7 years if you pay for me to come over on the boat. If they manage to live those 7 years, because it was not easy to survive in those early days, when that contract is up, their labor is no longer contracted to that landowner. And so they are free to go. They're free Englishmen. Yeah.
So they're not slaves anymore?
No, well, and they're never slaves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're always free people, but they've signed a labor agreement. So it's sort of like, it's like a contract, yeah. Yeah, so they've contracted out their labor for a certain number of years, yeah.
Okay, hold on just a second.
So thank you very much for your presentation today. The question I have concerns the current environment that we live in and a certain element of our society that might call this fake news.
Okay.
Or might call this whatever they want to call it. But what are your recommendations, or how do you suggest that we combat this element of our current society that wants to rewrite history and doesn't want to offend a current day people or students or whatever by recognizing that we have this past and we need to come to grips with it and learn and better our society. So do you have any recommendations about how we don't lose this?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I think, one thing I found here, especially doing the public work that I do, is that folks are really invested in their local history. Kentucky's the sort of place where you got people who have been here since some of the time periods that I'm talking about, and maybe think that their family isn't ever going to show up in any of these documents. So we didn't have, we didn't have money, we didn't have that, we're not going to show up. I have a student actually from Jessamine County who worked on the clerk's office project, and she was doing it because she wanted to get some independent study credit and just thought, oh, it'll be interesting, and never thought, oh, my own family's going to be in here. And she found her family. They actually owned some land that they sold to the university at one point. She found a whole series of connections. Jessamine was once part of Fayette County, so some of her family's records are in our records. And she was like, yeah, I mean, my ancestors came here from Europe. We didn't have any money. I didn't think we'd ever be the kind of people who'd end up in historical documents, right? And she really expressed that it helped her see just how much, this is everybody's history, that it's all of our history, and simply denoting that it happened, right, is one step towards better acknowledging this past, this collective past. And I thought it was really, really cool to have somebody who just was like, well, I don't think I'm going to be in here. To say, wait a second, this whole time I've been going to school on on a piece of land my family owned at one point. I think a way to approach the discussion is to really start by saying, look, there's good and there's bad in here. Is both of those things. And the stakes here really are about not just losing one piece of it, right? Saying, well, we can ignore those people over there. If you ignore one piece of it, you lose all of it. It's all gone. And for a place like Kentucky, right, that has such a rich role to play in the early republic, it is absolutely a space where people from all class levels, various religions, all cultural groups, right, are trying to work out, is this revolutionary promise going to be made good on or not, right? And all have a huge role in figuring out, right, if it's going to be made. Why would you want to ignore that? You really should celebrate that space that the Commonwealth has. And I always approach it through the local, right? What can I talk about right down the street from you, a space you know, a place you know, people you know, and you might be surprised. So like I said earlier, for example, today we think of Baptists as completely mainstream, right? But in this age, this era, they actually had to run from Virginia in some cases because they were being persecuted, right? And if you look at your local history and say, oh, wow, we happen to have like 5 Baptist churches here. Why were they all here, right? Well, because they found a place where religious toleration was real, right? So sometimes it's about finding the story that's local, that has meaning locally to somebody, that is an example from maybe their own personal history, their family's history, that says, hey, you actually do have a stake in this, and it's not so different from, right, people you maybe think of as so different than you. I also like to say, you can always go to the documents. That's why I like to show them. I know they're hard to read from the audience, but I like to show them, right? I don't like to just say, well, I read this thing, right? Because I could be watching TikTok. Like, how would you know? But to just show you here's the actual poster, here are the actual words. They weren't pulling any punches here, but here's what we can all learn together. And so that would be my suggestion. Start with the local, start with something that's familiar, and then go from there, because there are bigger stakes here, and they really are for all of us. Yeah.
Well, just a comment, history's always being rewritten. Who you're gonna believe, and you have to investigate yourself. You have to look at the source of information and say, wow, they're coming from this point. You don't have another source coming from this point.
Well, and that's why I tell my students, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to show you how, right? So if you're like, it's just like you said, right? Well, I don't just think this stuff up. I have evidence for it. But I invite you, please, like as a historian, that's what we really want is, yeah, you go read it, right? You go look at it, right? And so it's like you're saying, you can evaluate, right? Well, where are you getting this information? Is it that, it just makes me kind of feel bad. It's like, well, okay, but we got old paper here. We can see what people really, really thought in the past. Yes, ma'am.
Two brief questions.
Yeah.
Back to the indentured slave issue,
Servants,
or
yeah.
indentured servant issue. Were they primarily Eastern Europeans or Europeans wanting to come to America, or not from Africa?
So there are some examples of people of African descent who are indentured servants. They exist. And sometimes there's also a system of indentured for children. And so you'll see free children of color and free white children bound out. It's a kind of their version of social services. Anybody was eligible for indentured servitude. The indentured servants in early Virginia, overwhelmingly, they're from Western Europe. They're from England. They're from the British Isles. They're from sometimes along the West Coast, often Protestant. So if there are Protestant sects that are being persecuted in Catholic Europe, sometimes they'll, like French Huguenots, for example, or folks from the Netherlands come over. But they're from Western Europe, primarily. And then there are some instances of sort of forced indenture. So there are scenarios where particularly Irish people are forced into servitude, or they're shipped to, England loved to ship people from their various colonies to other colonies to get rid of people they saw as a problem. So another group, the Scots-Irish, people who were first expelled to Ireland by the English, and then they get expelled again to North America. So that's another kind of famous group. So there's a few different ways that people end up in indenture contracts, but almost no migration from Eastern Europe. Not in the 1700s.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Am I on?
Yes.
Okay, one other brief
Just
question.
hold it close.
About the children at the slave market. So say Liza was bought, but her 6-month-old child was not. Would other enslaved people take care of that child, or what happens to them?
That depends. So in that case, she was being sold in a lot with the child. So the idea was 2 for the price of 1, just to make sure the infant got sold. They didn't have to purchase the infant at the same time. Stephanie Jones Rogers, who's a historian at UC Berkeley, did some work on this, and there was another kind of line of slave sales where basically there was a business in buying up infants to then raise to sell on the market when they got older, or to purchase people who were ill, nurse them to health, and sell on the open market. Most of her work is about New Orleans, so I'm not sure if people who did that existed in Kentucky, though it's certainly possible. And then, yes, it's possible that then the child would be cared for by other people after their mother was sold. Family separation is one of the key traumatic events that formerly enslaved people talk about really, really frequently. And after the Civil War, a lot of people place what were called lost friends ads in newspapers, often religious newspapers, because preachers had a congregation they often could read, and so they read to them. So we have this archive of runaway ads, but we also have an archive of lost friends ads, and many of them begin with, "I left my mother in Lexington." They never say sold. They always use a euphemism. They say, "I left her." But we also have records of folks trying to find family, parents, siblings, anybody that was related to them well into the 20th century. I think the final examples of those kinds of ads are placed in the early 1920s. And sometimes they worked. Heather Andrea Williams' book, Help Me to Find My People, is all about those advertisements and people trying to track each other down after slavery. Yeah. You have a mic, and then we'll pass it over here. Yeah.
So my question is kind of like the lady in the purple, with public institutions. So like Ward Hall in Georgetown, I went there and visited because I like old places. I like to see what they look like. And so the whole tour, they were talking about, oh, the people who worked here, the people who worked here. But then the timing wasn't adding up. And I was like, do you mean enslaved people? And they were like, well, the people who worked here. And I'm like, are you talking about enslaved people? And so somebody was like, yeah, we do. So how does one grapple with that? Because I did write them an email. I'm like, you probably should tell people that you're talking about enslaved people, but I never got a response.
Is that a privately owned historic site? Yeah. So privately owned, privately owned place, like they get to do their own interpretation. There's been some movement to bring in experts like myself to help with interpretation of slavery. So actually, I did some work at Liberty Hall. They now have a fully interpreted kitchen space where they talk about one enslaved family who was with the Browns for a very, very long time. Some of them were freed by the Browns, some of them not. And actually, their descendant was still living in the home into like the 1930s, I think, before the colonial dames purchased it and restored it and all those things. And so sometimes they'll call us in to help interpret spaces and talk about how did people actually live, those kinds of things. But I've been on a number of tours where they would love to do anything but talk about slavery. And the thing is, like often the houses themselves were built by enslaved people. Often, much of Lexington was built by enslaved people. Much of Frankfort was built by enslaved people. As a descendant of enslaved people myself, I've never been embarrassed of my ancestors. I've never been embarrassed that they were slaves. I've never been embarrassed or that enslaved people built so many things and contributed so largely to society. I'm actually pretty proud of people enduring all they endured to accomplish that. I'm really proud of the craftsmanship at Monticello when I see what Sally Hemings' brother did with all those cabinets. So I think, I wonder who's uncomfortable and why. Certainly nobody here was alive during slavery. So I think it's really important that when you're present on those tours to make the point and ask them, are you interpreting any of this and who did this work? Because either they'll say the people who worked here, or it'll be kind of every English teacher's nightmare, the passive voice. Bricks were laid. Wainscoting was added. You're like, by who? A ghost? Who did it? It's like, well, no, human people, enslaved people. So I think it's important, so sort of to your point too, right? When you're in these spaces to actually just ask the question, who? who were those people? Were they enslaved people? Yeah, because certainly, like the enslavers themselves were in no way embarrassed about being enslavers. At the Todd House in downtown Lexington, they interpret slavery in every single room of that house. Every room of that house, you learn about slavery, because slavery existed in every room of that house. Because enslaved people cleaned every room of that house, and they built every room of that house. It's really not that hard to just say it plain. And the Todds were very clear that they were slave owners and they were not sorry about it. So why not tell the truth? They certainly told the truth about themselves. You have been waiting for a long time. Yes.
I just want to say that I've been here 11 years, and I grew up in Maryland, but my family's New Englanders. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know, well, first let me on a positive note say that when I moved here, I didn't realize how much history was here because I was ignorant to the fact because I didn't live here. But I find it very interesting that the state of Kentucky and the people that were like the Clay, what was he, a senator? From Lexington. Mm-hmm. And I find all that interesting where he tried to even keep the Civil War from happening. And I mean, there was a lot of things going on. And when you when you grow up in New England, where I was, where there's mostly European descent, which is now it's a lot more mixed, of course, but you know, you didn't realize as a child this history. But what I wanted to ask you, getting back to the real question, I know this is about Kentucky, but coming from New England, how prevalent was the slave trade up in Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island? Was it, you said 42% of, you know that 42% number?
Yeah, in Virginia, yeah.
Yeah, what percentage was, we know it went on because they find remains in Coopersville, you know, Cooperstown, New York, and all those places. How prevalent was it there? And, you know, for people to say, oh, well, no, it was just a Southern problem, you know. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that, can you?
Yeah. So anybody here know how many of the 13 colonies had legal slavery? All of them, yeah. So slavery was legal everywhere. And Vermont and New Hampshire have relatively low populations of people of African descent. There are black people there, they're there, and some of them are enslaved. But same with all the way up in what becomes Maine. It was Massachusetts, technically at the time. But Massachusetts definitely has an enslaved population, Rhode Island, Connecticut. They practice slavery kind of similar to very early Kentucky. People had relatively small slave holdings, and enslaved people were kind of part of one of many kinds of labor, from hiring in free European laborers to indentured laborers to enslaved laborers. Enslaved people often lived in urban contexts, so Boston, Providence, and were involved in kind of maritime work. So the work looked different. The sort of place that slavery as a business had in the economy was a little bit different. Oh yeah, the people who made the most money on slavery in New England were actually people who were involved in shipping and trade and commerce. Yeah, so like the Brown family in Rhode Island, famous slavers who made a lot of money on the Atlantic trade, So in some ways in New England, the big money that was made in slavery wasn't really in individuals who owned slaves themselves, but people who did the business of slavery, the trade itself. In the mid-Atlantic, New York, New Jersey, the Dutch were prevalent there. They actually did bring enslaved people with them. New Jersey actually has what was a slave belt at the time in the middle of the state. Perth Amboy used to be a major slaving port. The taxes were too high in New York, so they bring them in through Perth Amboy and sneak them across the river into Manhattan. Enslaved people built the wall on Wall Street. Enslaved people were a huge part of the founding of the colony. And some very famous enslaved people, like Sojourner Truth. Her first language was Dutch, and she's a New Yorker, she's from New York. So the big difference is most northeastern states began processes, either outright banned slavery or began processes of gradual emancipation by the early 1800s. There were still enslaved people in New Jersey when the Civil War started because they hadn't been grandfathered out yet, right? But slavery never had the same place in the economy that it did in southern colonies, but it absolutely was present, and enslaved people played a large role in kind of forcing those colonies turned states to live up to their revolutionary promise. It's court cases brought by a black woman and black man in Massachusetts that forced them to outlaw slavery. So they still had to be forced to do it. Does anybody know when slavery ends in Kentucky?
December 6th,
1865, because it took the ratification of the 13th Amendment to do it. Kentucky famously did not ratify the 13th Amendment. When does Kentucky ratify the 13th Amendment? 1976, symbolically, they ratify all three of the Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, So no slavery. The 14th, which is many things, including birthright citizenship, undoes the Dred Scott decision, and the 15th, voting rights. They symbolically ratify them as a part of the bicentennial year kind of moment. So it's important to note that. We didn't get really into the antebellum period today too heavily, but slavery was that big a part of the economy that even though the state didn't secede from the Union, they really thought they were going to get to keep slavery. In fact, there are people who flee Texas for Kentucky at the end of the war, thinking that they're going to be able to hold on. Yeah. Yeah.
This is just a shameless plug. I'm the curator at Liberty Hall.
Oh, hi.
And you're on point about Ward Hall, unfortunately. To not interpret slavery in 2025 is a choice. But we thank you so much for your work for the in the kitchen, but also we've expanded that.
Oh, wonderful.
And
yeah, we talked
so-
about that when I was there, and it's been a few years.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we actually have a new exhibit. Would love for anybody to come that follows the lives of multiple generations of enslaved folks who lived and worked at the hall. Some were manumitted by the Browns. Some we don't know their whole stories because of the record keeping, but we tried to interpret that. So that actually just opened in September. And if anyone would like to come see it, would love to show you all a lot of the new research that has been done on site. We also have had an ideal intern through the Decorative Arts Trust, which is specifically about interpreting BIPOC stories on the site. So that's actually a new tour in the garden that's going to happen probably in the spring. But a lot of historic homes has struggled with that in the past. And like I said, it's a choice. Even Whitehall, the Todd House, everyone seems to be at least trying to catch up to what they should have been doing a long time ago. But we do our best. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. I know we talked about that a few years ago when I did that work, and it's a great site. If you haven't visited Liberty Hall, you really should. And the connection to that revolutionary generation is so fascinating. The Browns themselves it's interesting because they really are grappling in a way that similar people in their generation do. At the same time that they can't quite get rid of the benefit, right? I can take one more, and then I gotta hand over the mic. Anybody else? Yes. Then they gotta get me off the stage because I could talk about this stuff all day. Yeah.
More plugging. If you could just talk about the the county clerk's records and making those digital, and also the Central Kentucky African Initiative.
Slavery Initiative?
Yeah, slavery.
Yeah. So Central Kentucky has a really rich history, African American history. I was surprised the extent to which there's been, relatively speaking, little written specifically about slavery. I have some great colleagues at the University of Kentucky. One, Gerald Smith, who's just recently published an edited volume, Return to My Old Kentucky Home, which are individual pieces about slavery in Kentucky. But really, there hasn't been a book that's only about, slavery makes cameos in all sorts of books, but only about slavery in Kentucky since the 1940s. And so when I saw how much documentary evidence is available here, I thought I'd start with the evidence first. So the county clerk's office, that's a partnership between the university, the county clerk, the mayor's office, the Lex Park actually gives us parking for our workers. So it's a huge partnership. And like I said, we've gotten through almost 200,000 pages of documents. Will books, court order books. We did all of the early city minutes. We're almost done doing every single deed book. We're looking into early school records, really to make it so that anybody can access these online in a archive quality PDF that you can zoom in on because it's all in cursive. And we are, right now it's organized, it looks very much like city government site, but we're working on the user interface so that people have a way easier time accessing these documents, so you can do your genealogical research in your PJs. You don't have to come stand on a hard concrete floor in a government building in downtown Lexington. And we did everything. So we've had lawyers and real estate agents use the documents all the time for the land deeds. We actually have I think he's a retired police officer now, who's doing some work on early law enforcement history in Lexington. Like I said, we have students who found their own families. And we also pay all of our workers, and we have both community folks and students who work on the project. So our community folks, who are mostly retired, can read cursive, and our students are not afraid of the scanner. So together, with their powers combined, we have done quite a bit and a little bit more to do, but our hope is to be able to take what we've learned to other counties, because there is a law in Kentucky that says you have to digitize your records. I think the law states it's only back to about 1960. With our project, we've been able to make sure Fayette County has everything all the way back to the 1780s. We even have some documents in French. That's how old they are. So that has been a massive effort. I do some work with the fine arts and fiber culture. So hemp is a huge product of Kentucky. All those cotton bales on the levees in New Orleans, that's Kentucky hemp. Kentucky blue jeans are a really important slave good. They're used as slave cloth and to clothe enslaved people. Levi Strauss lived where? Louisville, before he went out to California. So take that, Levi's jeans. It's a Kentucky thing. So that, from a fine arts perspective, they learn about Black fiber culture and Black fiber heritage to learn how to do fine art. I have another colleague who's helping work on a history lab so that students who take history courses get that hands-on experience in the clerk's office. We've had students go on to law school, library science school, think about a job in city government. So I'm really proud of the way we've been able to bring not just, I feel sometimes historians like move places and they're like, hello, I'm here, you're welcome, right? Who wants to hear that, right? I listened to folks in my community who wanted better genealogical resources and then pulled a group of community people together to do it. So like I said, focusing on the local, right? I'm not gonna go out to some other county and say, you gotta do this. But if folks there really wanna do it, I'm happy to show them how we did and help them out. So it really is community effort. Many people are descendants of the people, both Black and white are descendants of the people in these deed books. So it's been a really both lovely but enriching project. And ultimately, it makes things available for free, which is really critical, that our documents not be locked up behind Ancestry's paywall somewhere. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Holden. Everybody give her one more round of applause. Thank you so much. Before you all go, I want to let you know about our next lecture, which is tacitly related to this one. Home Ain't Always Where the Heart Is, Black Women and Confinement in the Gilded Age Bluegrass. Charlene Fletcher, the Francis S. Fessler Assistant Professor of History at Butler University, has been studying the Frankfort Penitentiary, the Kentucky Penitentiary that was in Frankfort for about 10 years. And as we were talking about with the 13th Amendment, prohibited slavery except for the punishment of crime. And contracted labor, prison labor started around 1805 in Kentucky, and with the 13th Amendment became the way to do slavery. And you can see the populations in the prisons become increasingly more Black. So please come out for that. That is December 13th. Thank you all.